Hi engineers, so in this video today we're going to talk about the white matter of the spinal cord and kind of a basic overview of the ascending and descending tracts. So let's go and get started. Alright, so when we talk about the white matter of the spinal cord, we also first have to talk about what in the heck is white matter. That's important, right? So what is white matter? Well, let's take a teensy little look here at the kind of structure of a neuron. You guys know that on the neuron we're going to have these little extensions called dendrites, right? And then we know that these dendrites are basically, the kind of the receptive region of the neuron. Then you're going to have this big structure here with the nucleus, which is called our cell body. And then here we're going to have the axon terminal or the terminal bulb, whichever you prefer. And then obviously the length of this structure here from this point here to this point here is our axon. The last thing that I want you guys to remember here is that you have these little lipid protein sheaths that are surrounding the axon, insulating the axon, allowing for action potentials to be carried quick down the axon. What are these structures? These little pink little fat structures hanging on these things is called your myelin sheaths. These are called your myelin sheaths. Now, what I want you to remember is anywhere on a neuron that you see myelin, I want you to remember that is going to give the neuron a whitish appearance. So the myelin sheath gives off a white matter appearance, right? So when we talk about white matter, I want you to primarily remember that it is the myelinated axons. What is white matter? It is the myelinated axons. Done. All right, so we know what white matter is. The next thing we have to talk about is another term that I'm going to be using throughout the course of this video, and that is a tract. Now, if you guys remember what a tract is, imagine here we have a bunch of cell bodies, okay? And then all of these cell bodies, they start giving off their axons. And these axons travel up as a bundle. These bundles of axons right here, this whole thing here, that is called a tract. So what is a tract? A tract is a bundle of axons, but primarily in the central nervous system. So it is a bundle of axons in the central nervous system. Boom. That's what I want you to know. All right, so we know what white matter is. We know what a tract is. Now let's go over the basic anatomy of the white matter in the spinal cord. So we have different parts of the spinal cord, right? And we know here's our gray matter. We've already talked about that. Well, now we have these columns here that we have to talk about, the white columns or the funiculi. We already know that we talk about the white columns based upon their position in respect to the gray matter. So here is this white column. It is posterior or dorsal to this gray matter. So this is called our dorsal white column, right? Or another term is our dorsal funiculus. This right here is our lateral white column. And again, because it's on the side. So these are your lateral white columns, and they are on the sides of the gray matter. So this is called our lateral white column or our lateral funiculus. Boom. All right, last one is we have our ventral white column. And the ventral white column is anterior to the gray matter. So this is our anterior white column. Beautiful. Sometimes there is another structure that can come up, and you can see this in books, and they kind of sometimes represent it like this. They show these lines crossing. There is a special name for that. We're going to write this down. This right here is called your anterior white commissure because it's in the anterior horn, the anterior white column. But this is where crossing of fibers occur. So whenever fibers come into the dorsal gray horn and they cross over to the other side, that is what that structure is. So what is this structure here? It's kind of, again, in the ventral white column, anterior white column, they kind of represent it with little cross lines. This is called our anterior white commissure. Beautiful. All right, so we talked about the basic anatomy of our white matter. The next thing that we have to talk about is that this white matter allows for information, right, to either move up. So if the information is moving up, right, so let's say that we have information moving up, right? The information that's moving up through these columns is called ascending tracts or ascending information. And this is usually sensory information. right? Sensory information. The other one that we're going to have to talk about that is also carried in these white columns is descending. So it's descending information. And descending information is usually going to be motor information. So in these tracts, what I want you to remember is that these tracts can carry information via their axons up as a part of your ascending tracts, right? And they can carry information down via the descending tracts. That is what I want you guys to know, okay? And what we're gonna do is we're gonna talk about some of these ascending and descending tracts in a basic overview way. We have other videos on our neurology playlist that cover all of these tracts in great detail. We're gonna cover this basic. All right, so the first kind of white matter tract that we have to talk about here is actually an interesting one because it kind of has an ascending and a descending type of function. This is called the tract of Sour. The tract of Sour is interesting. So what I want you to remember for the tract of Sour is it is involved in the pain and temperature pathway, but what it allows for is, let me explain it through kind of a visual here. Let's say I have 3 segments of the spinal cord, right? So let's say that here we have, let's say that this is the T1 segment, this is the T2 segment, and this is our T3 segment of the spinal cord. Now, what happens is, let's say that we have a pain and temperature stimulus. So here we're going to have a receptor, right? And it's going to be picking up pain and temperature sensations. When this receptor picks up that pain and temperature sensation, it carries it via the sensory neuron. And generally, we know that it goes into the posterior gray horn. Well, actually, that's not completely true. What happens is this neuron will go into the, right before the posterior gray horn, right? Let's imagine here I cut it off. Let's imagine I cut that portion off right there. What happens is, just before they enter into that posterior gray horn, they enter into this tract. And what this tract allows for is it allows for these pain and temperature fibers to ascend up 1 or 2 spinal cord segments. So you see how there was a pain and temperature sensation that were coming from the T3 spinal cord level? It actually won't synapse onto the posterior gray horn until it ascends 1 to 2 levels. Then it'll synapse on the cell bodies here in the posterior gray horn, cross over, and then ascend upwards via the spinothalamic tract. Why is that important? Because if you develop a lesion in the spinothalamic tract, let's say at T1 level, technically the loss of pain and temperature sensations isn't from T1 down. It's actually from 2 levels below where that lesion is, T3 and down. That's why it's important. So what do I want you to know about the tract of Sour? It allows for pain and temperature fibers to ascend or descend 1 to 2 segments, okay, before synapsing on the cell bodies in the posterior gray horn. Okay, so now we understand the tract of Sour. Let's now move on and talking about all the different columns, white columns of dorsal, lateral, and ventral white columns. All right, so we've talked about white matter. We've talked about what that means to have white matter, or what it means to be white matter. We talked about axons, that are a bundle of them in the central nervous system, being a tract. Right? We talked about the anatomy of the different columns, right? The dorsal white column, lateral white column, ventral white column, or another name is funiculus, right? So dorsal funiculus, lateral funiculus, ventral funiculus. We talked about the basic concept of descending tracts, which is descending motor information, ascending tracts, which is a sensory information, and we talked about this first kind of weird tract called the tract of Sour. Now what I want to do is, I want to take a cross-section of the spinal cord here, right? So I'm taking a cross-section of the spinal cord, and what I want us to do is I want to kind of draw an imaginary line here, right down the middle of the spinal cord. On one half, for kind of diagrammatic simplicity's sake, we're going to talk about all the descending motor tracts that are in the spinal cord, that are part of that white matter. And over here on the right side, we're going to talk about all the ascending or sensory tracts that are involved in the white matter of the spinal cord. All right, so first things first, let's kind of label these structures. The first one that is, out of all of these motor tracts, the most important is this one right here, this big son of a gun right here. This guy right here is called, and it's in the lateral white column. So here, we're going to make a line here to kind of separate. Right here is going to separate your lateral white column from your ventral white column or anterior white column. So in the lateral white column, there's only two descending motor tracts. What are those two descending motor tracts? The real big one that I want you to know is this one. And this one is called the lateral corticospinal tract. Okay, I want you to remember this one. This is the most important descending tract in the lateral white column. The other tract, descending tract, that's also present in the lateral white column is called the rubrospinal tract. It's called the rubrospinal tract. All right, beautiful. That covers the descending motor tracts that are present in the lateral white column. Now let's talk about the descending motor tracts present in the ventral white column. Okay, these ones are actually very interesting here. So let's cover this from kind of lateral inwards, right? So this first one here is called the lateral reticulospinal tract. The lateral reticulospinal tract. Then, if we move here, this is also a reticulospinal tract, but this one's lateral, this one's medial. So this guy is called the medial reticulospinal tract. Beautiful. Okay, so we got the lateral reticulospinal tract, the medial reticulospinal tract. There's another tract right here. This one, which is very ventral, but again, a little bit more laterally out in this ventral white column. This one is called your vestibulospinal tract. Then we move here, again, a little bit more medially. We got this son of a gun right here. This is called our tectospinal tract. And then the last descending motor tract present in the anterior or ventral white column is called our anterior corticospinal tract. All right, beautiful. So to recap, descending motor tracts, which are present only in the anterior white column, are lateral reticulospinal tract, medial reticulospinal tract, vestibulospinal tract, tectospinal tract, anterior corticospinal tract. In the lateral white column, the descending motor tracts are the lateral corticospinal tract and the rubrospinal tract. All right, so the last thing I want to talk about before we go talking about the basic overview of the ascending tracts, right, make up the white matter of the spinal cord, I want to basically cover something that's very important, which is called somatotopic kind of arrangement, okay, of this lateral corticospinal tract. We actually have to know this for 3 tracts total. The lateral corticospinal, the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway, and the lateral spinothalamic tract. For right now, I want to start with this lateral corticospinal tract. What I want you to know in simple way is that in the lateral corticospinal tract, the legs are laterally. That's all I want you to know. So if we were to kind of put this like this, technically sacral, since the sacral motor supply would be all the way laterally, then the lumbar, then the thoracic, then the cervical. If we were to kind of slice these out like this, this is actually what I want you to know. So whenever we talk about the somatotopic arrangement of the lateral corticospinal tract, the descending motor neurons in the cervical portion are most medially. The descending motor neurons in the thoracic are just out laterally to that. The lumbar, just laterally to that. Sacral, just laterally to that. Why is that important? If you develop a lesion that only affects this portion of the lateral corticospinal tract, what areas of the body are going to get less motor supply or no motor supply? The lower extremities, because this is the sacral and lumbar supply. If you develop a lesion that affects the medial aspect of the corticospinal tract, the lateral, then you're going to have no motor supply to the cervical, thoracic regions. So now your upper extremities and trunk are going to be affected. Okay? That's why I want you to know that. Okay, so now we know the descending motor tracts that make up the white columns, the lateral, ventral. Now let's talk about the ascending tracts that are going to be, again, a component of the white matter of the spinal cord. All right, so we talked about the descending tracts, right, which make up the white matter of the spinal cord. Now let's talk about the ascending tracts that make up the white matter of the spinal cord. So let's start here with our dorsal column. Do you guys notice something? There's no descending tracts in the dorsal column. That's important to remember. Only ascending tracts are present in the dorsal white column. So there are special names for these tracts which are present in the dorsal column, or that dorsal white column. If we talk about this tract, which is located more medially, this is called the fasciculus gracilis. If we talk about this tract, which is located laterally in this dorsal white column, this is called our fasciculus cuneatus. That's the first thing I want you to know. Okay, we're going to talk about, again, the somatotopic arrangement in just a second. Let's move on and talk about the other tracts first. So in the dorsal column, there's only the fasciculus gracilis and the fasciculus cuneatus. Fasciculus gracilis medially, fasciculus cuneatus laterally. Now let's go into this lateral white column. And again, we're going to separate these, put a line right here. Okay, so this line here is separating the lateral white column from the ventral white column. In the lateral white column, there's actually a bunch of ascending tracts, sensory tracts, right? This one here, on the outer side here, kind of in the dorsal aspect of this lateral white column, is called the dorsal spinocerebellar tract. So dorsal spinocerebellar tract. This tract here, which is actually located more ventrally in this lateral white column, this is called the ventral spinocerebellar tract. Beautiful. Okay, now this tract here is actually a very, very important one. This tract right here is actually going to be the lateral spinothalamic tract. What is this one? The lateral spinothalamic tract. Beautiful. So we have dorsal spinocerebellar tract, ventral spinocerebellar tract, lateral spinothalamic tract. One more tract here, which is in the lateral white column. It's this one right here. This son of a gun here is called the spinal-olivary tract. Okay, so we have all of these ascending tracts present within our lateral white column. Dorsal spinocerebellar, ventral spinocerebellar, spinal-olivary, and lateral spinothalamic tract. Now, before we cover the somatotopic arrangements of the lateral spinothalamic tract and the dorsal column, we're going to next talk about the ascending tract here and the anterior white column. So, there's only, thank goodness, only one ascending tract present within the anterior white column. What is this thing called? This is called our anterior spinothalamic tract. All right, beautiful. Now that we've covered that, we have to cover the somatotopic organization of the lateral spinothalamic tract and that dorsal column. So let's cover that first. Okay, remember what we said for the lateral corticospinal tract, right? We said legs laterally. Guess what? The lateral corticospinal tract and the lateral spinothalamic tract, both legs are laterally. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that the sacral sensory supply is going to be most laterally. The lumbar sensations are going to be a little bit laterally here. Thoracic, and then cervical. Okay, so lateral corticospinal tract and lateral spinothalamic tract, legs laterally. That's what I want you to remember. Okay, to finish up with this somatotopic arrangement, we have to come over here to that dorsal column. Now, the dorsal column, we said, has two areas here, right? The fasciculus gracilis and the fasciculus cuneatus. I want you to remember that the fasciculus gracilis is taking information from your lower extremities. Think about graceful legs, okay? Whereas the fasciculus cuneatus is getting it from the upper extremities. So again, if that's the case, then lower extremities are actually going to be in here first. So we have sacral, then we have lumbar, then we have thoracic, and then we have cervical. So technically, the fasciculus gracilis is taking sensory information from the lumbosacral area, and the fasciculus cuneatus is taking sensations from the cervical and thoracic area. Boom, roasted. We hit that. Let's move on to the basic functions of these structures. All right, so we already have detailed videos that cover all these ascending and descending tracts that we talked about over here in that cross section of the spinal cord, which we were kind of pretending is at the cervical level. what I want you to remember is that the basic functions of what we're going to cover here. If you want more detail, go watch those videos, okay, in our neurology playlist. But dorsal column, to give a basic function of this, we have to go back and talk about that fasciculus gracilis, and the fasciculus cuneatus. Remember, these are picking up what types of sensations? Do you guys remember? We've talked about this like a million times. It's picking up fine touch, so like your fine and discriminative touch. It's picking up vibrations. It's picking up proprioception. All of those sensations are being carried via a specific pathway called the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway, right? We have a video in more detail on that. What I want you to remember is that all that fine discriminative touch, vibrations, proprioceptions carried from the fasciculus gracilis is from T6 and below. Whereas all the fine touch, vibrations, proprioception, discriminative touch from the fasciculus cuneatus is going to be from the T5 spinal cord level and above. That's all I want you to know. Okay? Lateral white column. Okay? Again, dorsal column, just to recap. Was there any motor pathways, any descending tracts? No, only ascending tracts. Okay. Lateral white column. There was motor tracts, right? We said that the big one that I wanted you to know was that lateral corticospinal tract, right? So that lateral corticospinal tract. What did we need to know about this one? This will supply what? Again, this is 85% of that corticospinal tract. Again, it decussates at the pyramids, right? But the main thing that I want you to know is that this will stimulate the lower motor neurons, right? To allow for voluntary control of skeletal muscles. That's all I want you to know about this one. Again, you want more detail on this, go watch our video on that. Lateral corticospinal tract, it stimulates the lower motor neurons, and again, that allows for voluntary control of our skeletal muscles for fine-tuned type of activities. The other motor tract that was present within our lateral white column, you guys remember? It was the rubrospinal tract. That was our rubrospinal tract. Now the rubrospinal tract, its basic function is it is also going to stimulate lower motor neurons, but primarily for the flexors. Okay, so it's only going to pretty much stimulate your limb flexors. That was all of the descending tracts in the lateral white column. What were some of the ascending tracts in the lateral white column? Do you guys remember? One of them was the dorsal spinocerebellar tract. Spinocerebellar tract. Now the dorsal spinocerebellar tract, what did it pick up? It picked up proprioception. Again, for like the millionth time, what is proprioception? It is the three-dimensional position of our muscles, right? Our tendons, our ligaments, our joint capsules, all of that stuff in a three-dimensional space. It sends that and picks up proprioceptive sensations from what areas of the body? From C8 to L2 via Clark's column. What was the other white matter tract there? The other one was called the ventral spinocerebellar tract. And that was also picking up what? Proprioceptive sensations. And that proprioceptive sensations were coming from what areas of the body? This was coming from L2 to the coccygeal 1 area of the spinal cord. What was another white matter tract? That was called the spino-olivary tract. And the spino-olivary tract was important for what? Again, it picks up proprioception. But it sends this information to who? What structure? The inferior olives. So it sends it again to the inferior olives. And then the inferior olives will send this to your cerebellum. These are called your climbing fibers. Okay. The last one which we talked about was the lateral spinothalamic tract. And the lateral spinothalamic tract, we said that this one is going to carry what kinds of sensations? Primarily pain and temperature sensations. Beautiful. All right, so last one, ventral white column. We had all those tons of motor tracts present, right? We had, which ones did we talk about first? We said we had that lateral reticulospinal. Ooh, what is another name? I should have said this before. What is another name for the lateral reticulospinal tract? Because remember, there was two reticulospinal tracts. One's from the pons, and then one's from the medulla. Lateral, medulla. Okay? So technically, this is actually the fibers coming from the medulla. So the medullary reticulospinal tract. This one, for meduloreticulospinal tract, is primarily for flexors. So all I want you to know is that this stimulates flexors. Done. The other one we said was the medial reticulospinal tract. Oh, so what's the other one then? This one was the medulla. The other one was the pontine reticulospinal tract. So the medial reticulospinal tract is also called the pontine reticulospinal tract. This primarily supplies extensors. That's all I want you to know. The other one that we talked about is called the vestibulospinal tract. And the vestibulospinal tract, I want you to know that this one is primarily stimulating extensors, your anti-gravity muscles, right? The other one, there's so many of these dang things, the tectospinal tract. The tectospinal tract, I want you to know that that is going to be sending information for movement of the head and neck and eye movements. Boom. Roasted. All right. The last one here is your ventral or anterior corticospinal tract, right? So it's the same thing. Anterior ventral corticospinal tract. That was also going to stimulate lower motor neurons for voluntary. Voluntary muscle control. What type of muscle? Skeletal muscle control. Boom. That covered all of the descending tracts. There was one sensory tract in this one. It was the anterior spinothalamic tract. And this one carried crude touch and pressure sensations. Boom, roasted. We hit all of them. So now we know the basic anatomy and the basic function of the white matter of the spinal cord. All right, engineers, so in this video, we talk in pretty decent detail about the white matter of the spinal cord, its structure, and its function. I hope this made sense. I hope you guys did like it. If you guys did, hit that like button, comment down in the comment section, and please subscribe. All right, engineers, we love you, we thank you, we appreciate you, and as always, until next time.